Welcome to the screencast about secondary growth in stems with an emphasis on wood versus bark. A good division is indicated by the vascular cambium, which you know is the meristematic tissue that produces secondary xylem to the inside and secondary phloem to the outside. Essentially, everything to the inside of the vascular cambium is known as wood, and this is made up mostly of that complex tissue known as xylem, specifically secondary xylem. So this is going to include tracheids, vessel elements, parenchyma cells that are part of the ray tissue, and sclerenchyma fibers that are there for support. Bark, on the other hand, is everything external to the vascular cambium, and it consists of living phloem. So this is going to be functional phloem that is capable of transporting food and other dissolved substances throughout the vascular tissue, and the periderm, which you should recall replaces the epidermis in plant parts that are woody. The periderm is comprised of three separate tissues. We have the cork cambium, which is meristematic and produces a layer of cork to the outside. And then to the inside there is a layer of tissue known as the phloderm. Now when you're looking at a cross-section through a tree, you will often distinguish that there are two different types of wood present, and they're generally indicated by a color change. The heartwood is going to be this darker part of wood towards the center, and the sapwood is generally a lighter color to the outside. The sapwood is actually the functioning water conducting tissue. Heartwood, on the other hand, is non-functioning xylem. But it does serve a function. It's just not conducting of materials any longer. The function of heartwood is generally the storage of secondary metabolites and waste products that end up being sequestered in these non-functioning conductive tissues. Not only does the heartwood serve as a storage facility for waste and other products, but it can also lend a great deal of support, as these materials tend to be resistant to decay. I always like sharing this particular image from the book In Praise of Plants, as the caption says, "Solutions to the problem of excretion. An animal that stored its excrement would also be capable of becoming very tall." This dog here does not look very happy, and any of you who've had a pet and you've picked up after them know that an animal generates a whole lot of waste. But plants are also living organisms, and all living organisms are going to be producing waste. It's just that in the case of woody plants, that waste, a large proportion of it, ends up being stored in these non-conducting tissues. And this brings us to a point illustrated by this picture here of a car driving through this hollowed out tree. You might be wondering how such a thing is possible, because so much substance in the middle of this tree is missing. And the answer is that the center portion of a tree is the heartwood. It's non-functioning as far as conduction goes. It is basically dead material. The living part of the tree is just beneath the surface of the bark, and that goes for the phloem and the functioning xylem. So as long as the leaves up top are connected through this functioning vascular tissue to the roots underground, this plant can continue to be very healthy. A cross-section through a woody plant can help make this point even clearer. what we're looking at here is, right here is our cambial zone. So I'm going to draw it in this red line. So this is our vascular cambium. So everything external to this would be considered bark. So let's focus on the bark for just a moment. We have the peridermis, which is this outer region that has the cork cambium and the cork. And then we have our phloem. But notice that this phloem, only a small portion of the entire range of phloem is actually conducting. All of the phloem tissue external to that has been crushed and deformed by the increasing amount of secondary xylem internal to the vascular cambium and is no longer functioning. It is just this tiny little thin area adjacent to the cambium that is in charge of conducting food and other materials through the plant. Just internal to the vascular cambium is the functioning secondary xylem. This would be the sapwood. And deeper into the tree would be the heartwood. So what about hardwood or softwood? If you've ever gone furniture shopping, these are some of the choices that you're going to have. Essentially, softwood is going to refer to gymnosperms. So this would be including pine or spruce, and it's considered softwood because it has tracheids but no vessel elements. Hardwood, on the other case, is the wood found in woody angiosperms, and it is composed of both tracheids and vessel elements. So what about growth rings? Well, growth rings are possible in temperate areas of the world where there's going to be a seasonal difference in the relative growth of the vascular tissue. So in this example of cross-section of a conifer, we can see that we have an area of wood known as early wood, and we have a region known as late wood. So both the early wood and late wood would have been laid down within a single growing season, but earlier in the growing season the cells are larger than in the later. And this transition between larger and smaller cells ends up creating these rings that can be counted in order to determine the age of a cross-section of wood. Now, if you're going to take a core of a tree in order to assess how old the tree is, it's really going to matter how high up on the tree you're going to be taking the core. Because if you take a core from up high, so let's just imagine here, if you took this core and you counted, you'd measure 2 years. If you took it down a little lower, you'd have 1, 2, 3 years. And if you did it down here, we'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And down below, we'd have even more. And this is because at this point in time, this is the outline of the tree that existed after a few years of growth. So inside this tree, you can basically see the ghost of previous year's form of the tree. Now I'd like to call your attention to this structure right here, because what we have here is a branch that existed when this tree was just a couple years old, and yet that branch does not appear at the current time. It has died and it has been covered over by later growth of this tree. So this gives rise to those formations in trees known as knots. This knot here is referred to as a tight knot. And so what this is a branch that existed on the tree at some point in the past. Let's look at a diagram of how this works. So here is our cambium in orange, and you can see that at this point in time this is a living branch, and it is continuous with the cambium of the roots and the shoot up above. Now if we look at this branch down the line, in this case the branch has now died, and the cambium that extends below the branch and above the branch is no longer continuous with a cambium on that branch itself. And because of this, we end up with a region of dead bark. Okay, there's no longer any functioning phloem there. And this gives rise to what we know as a loose knot. So if you see a knot in a slice of furniture or wood that has this gaping area around, you know it's a loose knot, and at this particular point of the tree's growth, this branch was no longer living, it was no longer connected to the vascular cambium of the tree.